in the public health law program in the Center for State, Local, and Territorial Support proposed at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Long set of words, we use acronyms, PHLPC, stilts, CDC. While we wait, I think it's probably good for us to at least let you guys go around and tell us your name and the organization you represent and your title. We'll try to make it quick. So just those three things: name, organization you represent, and your title. We try to make these trainings as interactive as possible. We were talking about law, which can get boring and dry at moments. And we certainly don't like to be the only people that are talking during our training, so we'll call on you. I tend to call on the people who have the brightest clothes on. But I will certainly try to remember names as best I can. Throughout the day, as you're in speaking or engaging or being called on, just make sure you repeat your name so that we can make this as personal as possible. All right, so why don't we start with you? Smiling face over here. Name, organization, and position or role.
Sure. Kathy Cowan. I'm at Columbus Public Health, and I head up our Office of Epidemiology there.
I'm Varick Street, and I'm from Wayne County Public Health, and I'm the nursing director.
Mary Salantini Merriman. I am with the Union County Health Department, and I'm the epidemiologist for Union, Wyandotte, Hardin, and Crawford counties.
I'm Emmanuel Vidal. I work for HAL from the Maryland Public Health Department, and I'm an epidemiologist.
Excellent, welcome.
Jen Peggy with the Delaware General Health District, and I'm the Community Health Director.
Abby Chris, also with the Delaware General Health District, and I'm a community health specialist.
Abby Crowley, also with Delaware General District, and I'm a student intern.
Ariel with the DJHD, and I'm a community health specialist.
Edward Johnson with Columbus Public Health, policy.
Lisa Meenan, Fayette County Public Health, and River Health.
My name's Chris Cook, Madison County Public Health. Jimmy Davis with Big Wade County General Health District, and I'm the deputy. Sam Neal, Wade County General Health District, I'm an emergency responsible.
Stephanie DiGennaro with the Delaware General Health District, and I'm the Julian.
Same kind of Delaware General Health District, residential services.
Meredith Taylor, Director of State, and Executive.
Jason Orsini, Health Commission.
Heather Lane, Delaware General Health District.
Mark Largeman, Franklin County Public Health, TT Planning.
Franklin County Public Health, Emergency Care Supervisor.
Adam Howard, Delaware General Health District, Director of Personal Health.
Eric Penkel, Delaware County Prosecutor's Office.
Lisa Dutton, I'm a public health nurse at the Knox County Health Department.
Marie Bratton, Director of Public Health, Health Department.
I'm Nancy Bales, I'm Delaware General Health District, Administrative Assistant to the CDC.
Scott Servant, Program Manager, Delaware General Health District.
Excellent, excellent. So a wide variety of roles and positions in the room. This is going to be interesting today, very interesting. Are you the only lawyer? Only lawyer in the room?
That's probably weird, right?
Yeah. Only lawyer participant in the room. Excellent. All right. Do we have?
Got it.
Okay.
Almost.
So it sounds like you guys are from different counties, different organizational units, different roles and positions. One of the things that we like to get out of these meetings is an opportunity for you guys to talk with each other about these issues. We in our office tend to nerd out on public law related stuff. But I know that there's not often the opportunity that folks in the field get a chance to just sit in a room and talk about how law is impacting their work. And so part of our goal, again, in making this interactive is to give you room and space to talk about those things. One of the enumerated or listed goals of these trainings is also to kind of get you interested in talking with your attorney about the issues. So I know we've got one in the room, we don't want to bombard him, but hopefully something we say resonates with you and leads you toward having a discussion with your attorney about how law can be used to advance your community health goals, how law maybe is being a barrier to the work that you're trying to do. You guys are doing the work, and the lawyers on your team can help you facilitate how law can be used to advance your health goals. So, with that said,
We're gonna just, you don't have a clicker, is that okay?
no clicker.
I can just go to next, you can do it that way if you want. It's your PDF.
Yeah. So, can I do this?
Sure.
Does that
The
work?
arrows for the scroll. Scroll.
Nope. Nope.
Because it's mine,
We'll make it work. All right, so we've got to give a disclaimer every time we stand up and talk. Basically, this disclaimer says that although this has been cleared by so many layers at CDC, this does not represent any CDC agency determination or policy. In other words, if we say something CDC doesn't like, they're going to say that they didn't say it, we said it. We are also lawyers, but we're not your lawyers. We're not even the agency's lawyers. We are a set of lawyers, I like to call us public health practitioners trained in law that provide technical assistance, training, and opportunities for partnerships and that sort of thing for folks that are interested in understanding and using law as a public health tool. So if you need any legal advice and counsel about anything you hear today, please seek out an attorney that's licensed in your jurisdiction. And again, I encourage you to get to know your county public health lawyer. Next slide. This is who we are. I want to introduce you really quickly to two of my colleagues in the public health law program that are struggling here to try to get IT folks that are not IT folks. Tara Ramanathan serves as our team lead for legal epidemiology, legal research and translation, or basically legal epi. And Rachel Bogar is one of our staff attorneys, and her portfolio area is privacy and data sharing. Our program, our mission is simple. It's to advance the use and understanding of law as a public health tool. And we do a lot of things in that realm. Can you go to the next slide, somebody? We work primarily in three buckets. I've kind of mentioned them. The first is training and workforce development. We do stuff like this. We go out to jurisdictions across the country and try to get them thinking about the role of law as a public health tool. We also do what we call legal epidemiology, which by definition is the scientific study of law as a cause, factor, a factor or cause in the distribution and prevention of disease and illness and injury. The idea behind legal epi, really from my perspective, is we look at the variety of laws we see across all 50 states. And where we can couple that with health outcomes. And because we don't provide legal advice and counsel, we're not going to say one set of laws is better than the other. We can put it on paper and smart folks can read it and identify where they may have gaps in their legal language or enforcement or implementation of laws that we have on the books. And you're going to learn a lot more about that this afternoon. And our third team is really focused on communications and partnerships. How many of you guys have heard of CDC's Public Health Law News? Anybody? One hand. Do a quick Google search, Public Health Law News. It's a monthly digest of issues and happenings in public health law. We have issues that are local in focus, state in focus, federal in focus. There are articles, job opportunities, funding opportunities that we publish in Public Health Law News. It's really a great source of information for folks whose work touch on law and policy. And we serve absolutely everybody, absolutely everybody. On the previous slide, if you go back real quick, on our website, there's a box below that box where you can literally submit a question, a thought, or a comment. And I know that we get questions from health department. It's folks that want training. They request trainings through that box, or it may be a question of what other jurisdictions are doing with a specific issue in their community, and we try to help provide some legal research on those issues. But we also hear from folks that are clearly students that need some help in guiding their direction. And we've got a really amazing set of staff attorneys that are intellectually curious, and there's not a question that comes through that there's not someone in our office who's interested interested in researching or finding out the answer, or at least doing some comparative research on. Okay, next 2 slides. So today, we're gonna really touch on 3 overarching objectives. This is a competency-based training. We have what we call the public health law competency model that outlines the competencies in law that public health practitioners should have, entry level, mid-tier, and in supervisory roles. And so we built this training around some basic competencies in law that all practitioners should know. The idea is that we're gonna try to get you all on the same sheet of music. All this stuff will be repetitive for you. Some of the legal epi stuff will be brand new. But we wanna get you on the same sheet of music, and that's gonna be my goal this morning once we get through the icebreaker. We're gonna talk about what public health law is. I'm gonna take you back in time and look at some historical moments in public health so you can identify the role of law and how those 2 concepts have been intertwined throughout our history. We'll talk about who has the power to shape public policy or policy in public health, structure of government, so that the fabric and framework for the practice of public health in this country today. And then we'll talk about how this power is expressed, types and sources of law. Along the way, we're gonna talk about some key legal principles: federalism, police powers, preemption. And the goal there is to get you to understand how this theory impacts your work. Everything we're gonna talk about has impacted your work in some way, shape, or form. We wanna provide you the context so you can understand the why. Next slide. Again, we're basing this entire training on competencies. It's a competency-based training. Those of you who do any hiring or performance appraisals or anything in that line where there's work that intersects with law and policy, we encourage you to use the competency model as a way to set a framework for that work. You can use it for training purposes. You can use it for, again, for performance appraisals. If you're looking to hire someone who's trained in law, there's language here that will be helpful to identify the competencies you're looking for in those particular roles. Next slide. All right, we're gonna do an icebreaker. Back in 1999, 2000, CDC, in its morbidity and mortality weekly report, the MMWR, you guys are familiar with that, you guys not. Published an article talking about the 10 great public health achievements of the 20th century. And the article is wonderfully written. I was new to public health. I got to CDC in 2001 and kind of gave me a overview of what public health looks like and how scientific research can lead to better health outcomes. But what we found in that article is they may have listed or said law and policy maybe once or twice. It was very clear to us that the science by itself doesn't do the work. There is no public health in this country without the law. So the establishment of a health department, which is done by statute, to the passing of a clean indoor air ordinance, it's the law that creates the frameworks and helps make healthy decisions, default decisions. And my goal, one of my additional goals throughout this training is to get you to think through that lens. What we did after that article was written was we piggybacked and wrote a book chapter where we dove deep into those 10 issues and we identified the role of law in addressing those issues and achieving the achievements that were outlined in the MMWR article. And I used that and have been using that as an icebreaker for the last 10 or 12 years when we do these trainings. Set them up into groups. Each group gets one of the 10 great public health achievements: tobacco, healthier mothers and babies, safer foods, safer water. Fluoridation of drinking water was one of the great health achievements. For these trainings, when we go out to the field, what we've started to do instead of using that icebreaker is we've asked folks that helped us coordinate the training, folks that are participants in the room, we've asked a few folks, what are the issues that you're working on in this area? And what you see on the screen are some of the things that came back on the list. And so this is how we're going to do our icebreaker today. I'm gonna break you up into groups. Each of you are gonna get one of these topics, and you're gonna spend about 5 minutes brainstorming. Just brainstorming, brain dumping, ways that law has been used to advance those issues, laws that are on the books that are related to those issues. I'm looking for laws that are obvious and some that maybe not be so obvious but have downstream impacts on these issues. So, I think no one really gave me topic areas other than the preparedness folks. So it seems like you guys are all pretty broadly based. It should be easy to put you in groups and get you thinking. But I'm gonna ask you guys to spread out because we've got 5 topics. Yeah, can you guys just, for the sake of this exercise, choose a table, go to a table. We'll start here with you guys. Let me give you opioids. Prescription drug overdose, opioid use disorder. I'm gonna give you guys smoking, tobacco use, tobacco control. I'm gonna give you guys access to fresh foods. Access to fresh foods, healthier foods. I'm gonna give you guys communicable diseases. It's good? Okay, to the right table. And I'm gonna give you guys environmental health, which is super broad, purposely, so go for it. All right, so I'm gonna have one of you guys set a timer. We're gonna give them 5 minutes to literally write it up. What I need you to do is choose someone to be the writer and rapporteur, but we're gonna need someone to report back what your group has come up with when the 5 minutes is up. Cool? You tracking?
All right, Ed.
I don't mind writing. Someone else has to spokesperson. Yes. Which is, we're not getting specifics, supervised code.
Policy, you might be there as well, we'll talk about those, maybe a law.
Is that all code verified?
There also may be some standard operating procedures you guys have in place, those sorts of things are also.
trying to figure out how to explain it.
I'm just thinking RDA.
It's my first technology major, so what I write with is
All right, that's time.
that will go.
Put the slides back up.
Do you need them up for this?
I would like to.
What about the,
Yeah. Okay, next slide. Okay, let's start with the opioid group. Okay. So what did you guys come up with?
We had several, so I'll try to organize them the best I can. But, CARA, which provides money from the federal government, for the opioid epidemic, just defining what, illegal use is, legally, that's a big deal as well. Our increased funding for mental health and also classifying public health emergencies so that we can call the epidemic.
Yes.
Emergency.
Yes.
Legal exchange programs, here in Ohio, we have wars for the state pharmacy board, as far as reporting what physicians have to put in that system, who got prescriptions, when they last refilled, that kind of information. Let's see, there's.
Called ORS, that's your PMB.
OARS. I'm not gonna even try that one right now.
ORS.
Yeah, the Good Samaritan law, protecting people at the scene of an overdose. is
Y'all
very
have
common.
all the counties, or is it?
State.
Oh, it's the state, oh.
And then also drop boxes for people to put their prescriptions and other prescription medications. And there's some upcoming legislation that if it gets passed would inhibit municipalities from inhibiting their, first responders from carrying that.
Ah,
That's not in this document.
is there something on the books now that does prohibit them from carrying?
Efforts at local ordinances to prohibit their own law enforcement from carrying. So the state's gonna create everything. If you enact such a policy, you're no longer eligible for state funding.
Interesting. Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts on opioids or prescription drug overdose? I have a question about the drop box. Is that a law or is that a policy? Is that a organizational or a health department policy, or is there something on the books?
I think the state pharmacy board established the rules by which drug boxes are used.
Okay, so
Is
there's
there-
regulations around how they.
And the attorney general, I think it actually runs
Sheriff's office.
There has to be law enforcement involved present.
All the time?
Surveillance.
Okay, okay. Were there other thoughts on BDO with opioid front?
Yeah, it's been introduced.
Can you guys hear? We're talking opioid fatality reviews now. Okay, thanks, guys. What do you guys have? Go to the next one. Nope, smoking. Okay, so what did you guys come up with?
Well, Ohio has several things on the books, and we do a couple of things here locally too. Ohio has a smoke-free act, which is pretty much prohibits smoking in public places indoors. So there's mechanisms for filing complaints and doing investigations and leveling fines against facilities and places that don't comply. That's been on the books for quite a while. Here locally in central Ohio, we have a couple municipalities who have instituted what's called a tobacco 24
Are you gonna talk about tobacco 21 at all today?
A little bit.
A little bit. We've got a few of the communities that we've talked to across the country are implementing tobacco 21. So it's we're kind of tracking to see how that works and whether or not it really does impact smoking rates. I learned recently that it's excise taxes that has been the biggest driver in the decrease in smoking rates in the country, which is interesting.
You all had an initiative, right, a tobacco 21 initiative that was proposed, something, a couple of
Well,
years
she
ago.
mentioned Powell County and Columbus.
Powell City, which is here in Delaware County, and then Columbus City, which is in Franklin County, they both passed tobacco 21. They did. They did, yeah, they passed those local ordinances. We have a couple other local municipalities that are considering it, but nothing that I'm aware of. City of Dublin, okay, so there's several cities and municipalities that have passed that law.
Any other thoughts on law and tobacco use, particularly in Ohio?
I think one of the, this is probably something you guys look at in terms of policies. Or notice, we think that there will probably not be a difference between municipalities that adopt a licensing component.
What does that mean?
So essentially, we use our environmental health employees, we use our environmental health team to do checks. So we license all of our tobacco retailers, so we know who they are. And we'll go in and we'll use under 21 producers checks that are going to sell tobacco to someone you're performing a check. And that's subject to the disciplinary process where acting on the road, they produce their tobacco still license for us.
Has that been enforced? Has anyone lost their tobacco sales license?
Not
Not yet.
It is progressive discipline, so
Okay.
it was for a month and then a routine violation was posted.
Interesting. Yeah, another example. And certainly something that I think that can be studied with legal equity.
So there's some jurisdictions that won't pass the licensing, or won't pass the inspection.
I don't want to say it won't pass, it's, I think that goes into the rulemaking authority.
Got it.
As part of that, it's one of the district has like available resources for each municipality.
Yeah, and enforcing.
I think there are a couple of Ohio municipalities that passed the T21 without enforcement component.
Yes.
So they passed it, but there's no enforcement associated with it.
Really? Well, what's the,
I think it looks a little bit different for each municipality that passes it, because I know when Powell passed theirs, they use their police department to do the checks. They don't use us as the local health department. So I think the enforcement piece looks a little bit different, probably depending on what resources are available and which agency has the capability to do it. If it were a countywide thing, it might be more appropriate for us to be involved, but since it was a Powell City regulation, we as the county health department or general health district thought it should be up to Powell to enforce that, it's their local ordinance, so they're using their own police department.
interesting.
And in these cases, does the city also have its own health department, or is it just the county? No, we're a general health district, so we provide, like, the food licensing, pool licensing, we do a lot of their services, but since that was a local ordinance, they took on the enforcement through their police department. That's fairly common, I've heard of that everywhere. We were just in New Jersey, same thing.
Okay, let's move on. Next one, access to fresh foods? Yes. All right, what do you guys come up with?
So we came up with SNAP. And that's.
It's usually this picture that's up here.
Yeah.
It's
Look at
very,
the colors.
very farm to table-ish picture. It looks delicious.
Delicious, I know.
And then we also had the school lunch program, they have in schools. And then, back in 2010, Michelle Obama doing the Healthy Hunger Free Kid Act. And then, like doing farmer market, kind of like partnerships. And then, like demolishing vacant buildings in order to turn them around into community gardens.
Using zoning laws, which might fall in the health, to increase access to That's good. Other thoughts on access to fresh foods? Reduction of food deserts? Any other thoughts? That's good. Okay, What you guys have? Communicable diseases? No, communicable diseases?
So a lot of the communicable disease information in Ohio is based on revised code and administrative code, which is the laws and rules of Ohio. Some of the things in there are defining what's reportable, vaccination laws to enter school, isolation quarantine requirements, TB, both the local control unit and at the national level, the immigration laws there. The criminal code, specifically you can't have sex with someone without telling them that you're HIV positive. Some states have wedding requirement, testing requirements, the ability to close mass gathering events, and if we go further, food rules, sewage rules as well.
Yeah, so much, bread and butter of public health in many instances, absolutely. Other thoughts on communicable diseases? I think you guys covered the gamut. Disease reporting we get, quarantine, isolation. Other thoughts? Did they leave anything out?
We talked about testing for HIV and, yeah. Does Ohio have a criminalization statute? I can't remember.
You mentioned it, criminalization.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
But I'm wondering about enforcement. So what does enforcement look like around that in Ohio? You guys know?
We prosecute that.
Instead of with conviction, we prosecute that.
People go to prison for it.
Good to hear. Good to hear it's being enforced. Not necessarily good to hear the folks have to go to prison. Okay, environmental health. And I heard you guys talking about housing. And then we've got a housing picture up here.
We were kind of all over the board because it was so broad.
Yeah.
So we talked about nuisance laws and what rights health districts have as far as reporting or like eyesores to the neighbors. And a lot of things fall under housing codes unless there's certain things like the running water, the township space need to get involved. But maybe the township or space of housing codes specifically, it's important to keep their laws and things like that. We talked about water quality and standard laws and regulations for that. We also talked about mosquito trap and fogging, which is kind of a big one this time of the year. So some people don't want their property to be fogged if it's a positive West Nile, or we have regulations on if it's being in place or if it's just a mosquito feedback positive. So a lot of times they can opt out to have their property fogged, but if you're in the city and you're opting out, then you just sit in your house. So yeah. And then we talked about food code as well, inspections around that.
So much in the environmental. I mean, we really just kind of touch on all the things that we talked about. Is there anything you guys want to add to the environmental health bucket? Yeah.
Only because it's Ohio, you want the pollution caused by agricultural runoff. Just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, definitely. Any kind of pollution, but agricultural runoff, that's a thing in Ohio?
That's a huge thing. There's a huge water bill for surface water right now in Ohio that's being paid. Just Governor Casey ordered, executive order to enforce it, and the school committee pulled it.
That's some interesting happenings in the state of Ohio. All right, next slide. So our goal with that exercise is to demonstrate to you, or have you demonstrate to yourselves, the role that law plays in shaping public health in this country. Next slide. So I'm going to start now into the lecture portion of my morning. And we're going to try to define public health law for you. We're going to try to break the definition down and provide some historical examples and modern examples. And then I'll talk a little bit about limitations on the authority that we have as governmental actors in public health. And then I'll turn the mic over to Rachel to talk about another limitation on our authority to act as public health practitioners. So what is public health law? When you think about public health law, what comes to mind? Anybody? Orange shirt. What's your name again? I'm sorry. Say your name? Lisa. Anything, just pop, you right answer, I'm sure. Anybody? Somebody, say it again? Authority. Quarantine. What else?
Protection.
Protection. I heard somebody say rulemaking earlier. When you think about law, I want you to think about two key purposes or two key pieces of how we define public health law. Next slide. This definition comes from a guy named Larry Gostin, who's sort of the grandfather or godfather of public health law, depending on who you ask. And he offers this definition. Public health law can be defined as the legal powers and duties of the state to assure the conditions for people to be healthy, and the limitations on the power of the state to constrain the autonomy, privacy, liberty, proprietary or other legally protected interests of individuals for the protection and promotion of community health. The reason we like that definition is because it offers the framework that really tells you, yeah, we've got some legal authorities, but there are limitations on that authority that are legally important for us to consider as we do our work. And my lecture is going to sort of point to those key pieces of this definition: the legal powers and duties of the state, our authorities, and the limitations on the power of the state. And by state, I mean governmental unit. So it can be the government, the federal government, it can be the actual state government, or the local government. So the governmental unit. Next slide. Again, I'm going to take you back in time. This may feel a little bit like civics class with a little bit of public health mixed in. Because our legal history and our public health history really does sort of outline and frame our authority and the limitations on our authority. Next slide. So let's go back in time. How many of you guys recognize this guy here? John Snow. J-O-H-N Snow, not J-O-N Snow, not winter is coming snow. Yeah, John Snow. So how many guys, what is the John Snow story? Anybody? Yeah, go ahead.
He was the one that discovered that the cholera epidemic was based on the city water supply.
Exactly, exactly. And then what happened? What'd he do? He took the handle off the pump, right? That's the way I learned it in public health school. John Snow is an anesthesiologist. It's the 1800s, 1850s in London, Soho, in a neighborhood, and there's a cholera outbreak. And this guy, John Snow, creates the first, next slide, the first dot map where he identifies that the deaths from cholera were really centralized around this one pump, the Broad Street pump, right? So he creates this dot map, and then he goes and takes the pump handle off. That's not really what happened. He took his findings to a legal body, what would be equivalent to a board of health now, perhaps a city council, and he argued in front of them that this is the source of the cholera outbreak. And they were like, no, it's not. That water is the coolest, clearest water out of all the pumps. He's like, yeah, because it's dug deep, but I'm telling you, that's where the cholera outbreak is. No, that can't possibly be it, because there are people who live way out on Marlborough Street that aren't anywhere near the Broad Street pump. Oh yeah, but they go to school right there by the Broad Street pump. So he convinced the legal body to have the pump handle removed. It's important to think about that, because as we think about the 10 great public health achievements, it's not just the science. It's public health science and insight coupled with legal might that where we see improved health outcomes. And so, you know, as you're in MPH school, are you in MPH school? What graduate school program? Bachelor's in public health. You've heard the John Snow story? From now on, you're going to tell it with the real ending. He actually took it to a legal body. Now, the way we hear the story, that they actually put the pump handle back on pretty shortly after that, because the community was like, no, they can't possibly be it. But it did lead to improvements in the water supply and water systems in London, Soho, and throughout the city of London. So that's one story where you can see the connection between public health and the law. Next slide. What you see on this screen is Varick Street in New York City. And again, this is the late 1800s. And yes, that's trash that's piled up on the side of the road or the side of the street in the alleyways. Now, the way the story goes, the cholera outbreak in London, Soho started because somebody threw a dirty diaper out the window. Well, we weren't just throwing dirty stuff out the window in London, Soho. It was happening in the United States as well. If you weren't rich or affluent and could pay to have your trash picked up, it just built up like this in the alleyways. And the rich folks were like, oh, Scott, they're getting sick because because it's something in the air. It's clearly in the air because we can smell it. It's miasma. It couldn't possibly be anything else, right? We learned that coupling public health insight, learning that it possibly is this trash exposure that's causing disease and illness in the community. And 2 years later, next slide, after legal policies being put in place that require tax dollars being used for trash pickup, we see a significant increase in the cleanliness of the neighborhood and a decrease in the burden of disease. Next slide. What we see here is a slide that sort of shows the marked decrease. Early 1900s, late 1800s is when we begin to see the reformation of sanitation in New York City. And you can see a marked decrease in the disease burden after that. What's interesting is New York is right now one of the largest sanitary systems in the world. Over 7,000 uniformed sanitation workers. They pick up 12,000 tons, I think. A lot of trash. A lot of trash. Next slide. The third story that I want to tell you about is Jacobson v. Massachusetts. How many of you guys have heard of Jacobson v. Massachusetts? Yep. Okay. So if you don't remember anything else I say today, this is probably the most important thing to remember. I want you to remember everything I say, but this is among the most important things to remember. All right, so it's 1902, there's a smallpox outbreak. There's a guy named Reverend Henning Jacobson who refuses to be vaccinated as the law mandates in the city of Cambridge. And there's some that say he refused to be vaccinated because he'd had a adverse impact of a vaccination as a child, and so he refused to be vaccinated as an adult. There are some who argue, and I think that this is probably truer, that he was the perfect face of the anti-vaccination movement at that time. And so they encouraged him to not get vaccinated, to argue that it's a violation of his privacy rights. And so he did. This case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. What's interesting about this case is there had been many, many public health cases on the state level, throughout the 1900s. But this case was the very first case that applied modern constitutional principles to public health issues. This case of Jacobson was a mandatory vaccination case, and the Supreme Court made it clear in that case that states had the authority to use their police powers to advance public health goals. They've got to be grounded in science, evidence-based. This case really opened up this idea that states have the primary responsibility for advancing public health, and so they clearly have to have the authority to mandate mandate vaccinations in situations like what was happening in the 1900s. So this case is still applicable today. I have people, my students, that will ask me, well, why are people still suing about vaccinations? There was a case in, I think it was New York, where someone was saying that you shouldn't be able to exclude my child from school because I don't want to get them vaccinated. And we feel like this is pretty clearly established. It's been established for over 100 years that we can mandate vaccination. People can sue for anything, right? And so language from Jacobson continues to be used today in case law. Folks cite all the way back to that case because it is one of the most important cases in our public health history. So now you know it, Jacobson v. Massachusetts. Next slide. What I want to point out from that case is in the findings, Supreme Court made it clear, this is one of my favorite lines, there are manifold restraints to which every person is necessarily subject for the common good. It really established this idea that yes, we do have legal authority. We do have a responsibility and a duty to protect our population's health. But there are indeed limitations on that authority, right? And yes, as individuals in the United States, we have a set of rights, and I'll talk about those in a little bit. But there are limitations that can be placed on their rights to ensure that we are protecting the general welfare and advancing public health. Does that make sense? All right, next slide. All right, so let's talk about tobacco control. You guys have had that as your group topic, but it really provides a really good example of how we watched public health science grow. But it wasn't until the law started getting involved, that we really see a decline in tobacco use in this country. So we see here, during World War II, there was a huge uptick in tobacco use in this country. Does anybody know why? Cigarettes and the GI, in the mess kits, right? It was a policy that we put cigarettes in our soldiers' mess kits in World War II. And so they become addicted to smoking. And then what happens when they come home? Their wives, their family members. And so that's where we see the uptick. And then we see the science, right? The education, the first Surgeon General's report, the first Great American Smokeout. And then we start seeing policy change, and we can start seeing the decrease, right? The non-smokers' right movement. And then we always put the federal cigarette tax doubles up there, because again, that is where we have seen as the largest driver of the decline in tobacco use in this country. Next slide. So this history forms the foundation of public health law today. All of these historical points, there actually are more that we include. They only gave me an hour and a half, which I'm about to run up against. And there's a training on what we call the Public Health Law Academy, publichealthlawacademy.org, that really dives into some of these historical moments in public health and the law. It's free training on demand. It's about an hour long. There are 9 trainings total, different topics. I didn't bring any of the brochures, but it's easy to find, publichealthlawacademy.org. Next slide. My favorite quote from Michael Bloomberg just sort of sums up what this piece of the lecture is about. He says, in the realm of public health, it's the law that really does the work. It's been demonstrated time and time again, from things like ranging from mandating vaccinations to requiring automobile seatbelts, improving workplace safety, inspections of meat products, fluoridation of water. Public health succeeds by making healthy choices the norm. And law is what helps do that. Next slide. So how many of you guys have seen this slide, this pyramid before? See a few hands going up. So this is Tom Friedman's health impact pyramid, former CDC director Tom Friedman. And he used this to sort of delineate interventions as they related to tobacco control. And we have found that it's applicable to just about every issue in public health. When I first got to CDC in 2001 as a lawyer not assigned to an Office of General Counsel, I really wasn't sure what my role was. It took me a while to figure out that there really is, as I mentioned, there's no public health law. You guys need lawyers, not just as representatives for the agency, but to think through how law can be used to do your work, right? But when I saw this pyramid, this is when it all kind of came together for me. So let me tell you what this pyramid kind of is depicting. The idea here is that as you go up the pyramid, it requires more individual effort to do the thing, right? As you go down the pyramid, it takes less individual effort. So education and healthcare, right? You go to your doctor tells you should reduce the sodium in your diet. We know education works. But if you're not changing the context, you're not going home and telling my grandmother to take the salt out of the food she's cooking. If you're not reducing the number of fast food restaurants in my neighborhood, if you're not changing the context, it's less likely that I'm going to comply. It also takes a lot of effort for me to get to the doctor, to access that care, to get that education. Clinical interventions and long-lasting protective interventions also require access to care. And again, there tend to be one-offs, right? Long-lasting protective interventions, you go get your vaccination, that's it, right? So when we think about changing the context to make individuals' default decisions easier, this is where the law comes into play. Even the examples that Tom Friedman gave in describing this pyramid were law-based examples in this section. Removing trans fat, using log fluoride in our drinking water, those sorts of things. We change the context so that it makes people's default decisions healthier. We decrease the number of fast food restaurants. It makes people's default decisions healthier. But what's important to note is that the real thing that improves population health, and you guys all know this, working on a local level, is addressing socioeconomic factors. And what I'd like to say here, two points. One, if we make changes in our education system, changes in transportation, changes in our economic system, it's very hard for people not to have some sort of benefit from that, right? It becomes harder for them not to benefit just by being here when we change the context of our socioeconomic factors. The other key point I'd like to make here is law, how we use it, how it's structured, whether we direct folks toward drug court or the criminal justice system. Law is a socioeconomic factor that definitely impacts health. When we think about the fact that, you're gonna show our RWJF?
Yes.
Have you guys ever seen the RWJF, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation maps that identify the difference in life expectancy based on zip code? You could be like 3 miles away from each other and have a 12-year life expectancy. That's not flu. That's not our traditional public health issue. That's socioeconomic factors, and some of that has to do with law and enforcement of the law, right? We'll talk about that later on this afternoon. All right, so I'm gonna launch into structure of government, next slide, and talk to you about who has the power to shape public policy to improve public health, the difference between what we can do on the federal level versus what happens on the state level, and some of the technicalities and the framework around that work. Next slide. So it's important that we look to the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution lays out 3 key things. One, it distributes power among separates powers among our congressional branch, our judiciary, and our executive branch. It also sets up a system of distributing power among the federal government, the state government, and local government, as well as tribes and territories, although our tribal relationship is not written in the Constitution, it's all done by treaties and federal law. And then the third thing that it does is it outlines this idea that, yes, we have the authority to act, but we've got to balance that with people's civil liberties. It outlines what that balancing act should look like and the limitations that we have in government in using law as a public health tool. So the Constitution is critically important. Next slide. For today's purposes, we are really going to focus on 4 key things, Rachel and I, in talking about structure of government, this sort of framework and fabric of U.S. public health powers. Separation of powers, I'm going to touch on really quickly. This idea of spending and the importance of spending in the realm of public health. And then Rachel's going to talk to you more about federalism and preemption. So, you guys know this, but it's worth pointing out. On the federal level and on the state level, we've got 3 sort of columns of power, right? Our legislative branch, our executive branch, and our judicial branch. It's important to know that our legislative branch is the branch that creates the laws. Our executive branch, and those of us who work for executive branch agencies, are responsible for enforcing those laws, oftentimes in the form of writing regulations that really get at the intent of statutes, which we'll hear more about in Rachel's up. And then we have the judicial branch that interprets laws. When we think about the Jacobson case, Jacobson interpreted the legality of a statewide mandatory vaccination law. Jacobson made it clear that states could delegate their authority to local governments. It interpreted the law in that judicial case. So this system, again, we got this on the federal level and on the state level, and each of these players has a role in advancing public health. We can think of examples. Our legislative branch writes the laws, right? And then our executive branch, those of us, again, who work for executive branch agencies are often responsible for writing regulations that move those laws forward, puts meat on those laws, and tell people what they can and cannot do, prescribe conduct. And then our judicial branch, as we've seen with the Affordable Care Act, was the judicial branch's responsibility for determining whether or not it was legal under our system of federalism for the federal government to require individuals in a state to purchase something. Now, as someone who's been studying the Constitution for a little bit, I think it's questionable whether or not it's a tax, the Affordable Care Act, whether or not it was a tax, but that was what the judiciary, how they interpreted the law. The Affordable Care Act was a valid authority of the taxing and spending power of our U.S. Congress. Very arguable, I still think, but that's what it came down to. Next slide. So the federal government has what we call enumerated powers. We also have implied powers, and we've also got concurrent powers that we share with the state. It's important to think about this because ultimately, and you'll hear us say this several times today, it's the states that have the primary responsibility for public health. Under our system of federalism, I used to, when I first got to CDC, I used to get lots of questions. Why didn't you guys go into Katrina and save everybody? Well, we went in when they asked us because of the system of federalism. This idea that states have their police powers and the ability to control what happens within their borders is critically important. And without being asked to come in, unless something, and there are always exceptions, but unless something is going beyond the state borders or you've exhausted your resources, we typically are not going to come in on the federal level unless we've been asked to come in. I say typically because I know it doesn't always look like that. But that's the way the system is set up. Next slide. So enumerated powers. What are some of the enumerated powers of the federal government? Anybody know? What can the federal government do according to the U.S. Constitution?
Interstate trade.
Interstate commerce, absolutely. We can regulate interstate commerce. Yes, sir. Common defense, that's right. We can build the Navy and the war folks, yes. What else can we do on the federal level? Tax and spend, yes we can. What else can we do on the federal level? Immigration, absolutely. Treaties with foreign countries, right? On the federal level. These are what we call enumerated powers, listed powers, delineated powers. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution tells us exactly what we can do in the federal government. This is done purposely. Remember, the colonies existed, and they wanted to maintain their power, and they only wanted to give the federal government a limited set of things that they can do. And everything else was reserved to the states. The states retained all other authority. That's this concept of states' rights, right? That's why police powers matter so much in public health work. Next slide. And then there are implied powers. And there's a clause in the U.S. Constitution that's called the necessary and proper clause. Some state constitutions have similar language that basically says, although you've given us enumerated powers, we can still do what's necessary and proper to move the country forward. That's implied powers. And oftentimes the judiciary will interpret actions that we take on the federal level as necessary and proper to address maybe an economic scheme that we're trying to deal with in the country, to improve economic conditions in an issue. It's one of the interesting ways that we can get our hands in things that we probably shouldn't have our hands in. Next slide. And then there are concurrent powers, things that we share with the states. So states and the federal government collect taxes. So states and the federal government both have the authority to tax and spend. We build roads. Federal government tends to incentivize the building of federal highways by providing funding to states to build roads. Both the state and the federal government establish bankruptcy laws and bankruptcy courts. And then both the state and the federal government establish and create lower courts within the court system. So we see district courts on the federal level and then lower level courts on the state level. Next slide. This idea of reserved powers is what matters the most for your purposes. The idea that the states retained their police powers really is the foundation of your work. And I took out the slide defining police powers because I wanted to save that thunder for Rachel. She's going to talk about that. But this idea of police powers is what we study. We study how you're using your police powers on the state level. And it varies across all 50 states. And if you think about states then delegating their authority to local jurisdictions, we're looking at an issue like helmet laws, where there are 22 state laws, but 202 local laws on that subject. Police powers is really where it's at. It's how are you using your powers, those powers, to advance population health that we're studying. Are you using them in a way that results in the health outcomes that you're looking for? Next slide. So under the 10th Amendment, states retain the primary responsibility for protecting the public's health. It's the 10th Amendment that makes it clear about this concept of reserved powers. The federal government should only be able to do what's enumerated and in instances, what's implied. Next slide. But I saw some tips now, and I mentioned this earlier. There are ways that we, on the federal level, tend to get involved in what happens on the local level, and the primary way is through our taxing and spending authority. What you see on the slide are some mugs of beer and a highway and a car. What do you think I'm getting at there? DUI laws, funding. Wait, say somebody probably heard it. Legal drinking age. All right, so, were you gonna say something?
No, she said, I was just saying at the back.
All right, legal drinking age. Okay, so, every single state in this country has a minimum drinking age of 21. Because we made you do it. We didn't make you do it, really. We just said, if you don't maintain a minimum drinking age of 21, we will withhold, I think it's 15% of your federal highway transportation funding. So South Dakota in 1986, 87 said, we want our children to be able to drink at whatever age we want them to be able to drink it. States' rights, police powers. And they sued the federal government. They said that the action of requiring us to maintain this age and withholding our funds is a violation of federal principles, a violation of constitutional principles. And this case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, this is a valid exercise of Congress's taxing and spending power. You don't have to take the money if you don't want the money to stay in South Dakota. Now you have minimum drinking age of 21. We've seen this in many things, right? Medicaid, Medicare funding, right? States have the option. You want to do it the way you want to do it, you don't necessarily have to receive the funding. But we incentivize local action through our funding, and it starts with the administration that we're in and the direction they'd like to see funding going. 75% of the appropriation dollars that we get go right back out the door. But we tend to focus on the issues that are of importance to that particular administration. That's how we incentivize local action. Certainly one of the key ways that we do it. Next slide. So there are some limitations on this power. I am doing really good on time. There are some limitations on our authority. And again, this structure of government lecture that I just did in 10 minutes is an hour-long lecture online. These are snippets. And then there are semester-long courses that you can take on all this stuff. But again, on the publichealthlawacademy.org. There are limitations on this power. Two primary limitations that we're going to talk to you about today. The first is preemption, this idea of a higher level of government preempting a lower level of government from acting. We heard a local example, potentially, of preemption coming here in Ohio. Preemption happens from federal to state, so the federal government may preempt state action in some areas. Think about things like air safety. So like Delta Airlines would have a hard time complying with Ohio's laws if they're different from Kentucky's laws, right? So the federal government's like, well, y'all just stay out of that. We'll pass one set of laws. Because there's interstate commerce involved there, that's where the authority comes from, and it would be impossible for folks to comply if that was the case, going from state to state, flying through the air, right? So the federal government has preempted states from passing laws that address stuff at some height, some certain height in the air, because states can do drone stuff. So there's some airspace that states can regulate. But we control sort of the national airways via preemption. And you're going to learn more about preemption from Rachel later today. The other key limitation is this idea, going back to sort of the through line of my presentation, this idea that we have to balance our authority with the civil rights, the civil liberties of the population with which we're working. So next slide. Oh, I talked about this one, we can preempt action. I talked about this one, individual rights versus the common good. So this is what we're going to talk about next. Limitations focused on balancing individual rights with the common good. Next slide. All right, so let's talk real quick about the Bill of Rights. First 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Can anybody tell me any of the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution? Freedom of speech. Right to bear arms, that's usually number one, and loud. Oh, search and seizure? Yep, what else? Anybody? Did somebody say religion? Oh, okay. What else? You could house soldiers, that's right. taking, go ahead, that's not one of my examples. But good, that's good, good job, lawyer, good job. These are some examples of constitutional rights that we've chosen to select to put on the slide. These are just some examples of the Bill of Rights. What I'm gonna focus on, for our purposes, is due process and a little smidge of equal protection as a limitation on our authority as public health actors. Next slide. So according to the 5th and 14th Amendments, the government cannot deprive individuals of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So, I can't take your property without due process of law, right? As a government official, I can't go into a hoarding, somebody mentioned hoarding over here in the environmental health. I can't go into an environment where there's clear hoarding without, and remove them or take that property without due process of law. What is due process of law? Yes, sir. Going through the courts, right? There's gotta be some sort of system, right? So imagine, you've got some property, I wanna come take it. What do you think should happen before I come take your stuff? I'm a government actor, I'm coming in to get it. I'm gonna build a government building on your property. Show me what, first of all, it's responsibility. That's not quite version of the due process of law to show me the money part, but the conversation, yeah.
Come forward with the stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Give me something,
Yeah.
some sort of hearing, some sort of process to tell me what it is you're doing before you take my stuff away, right?
And then we'll talk.
Another piece of that, another piece of show me something is the why, right? Does it make sense what you're doing when you take my stuff, okay? Now my stuff can be property, it can also be my personal liberty, my freedom, right? Same concept. Before you take my freedom, there needs to be some sort of conversation with somebody who matters to tell me why and how, right? Okay, so I want to say this real quick. The 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution applies to the federal government. Excuse me, the 5th Amendment applies to the federal government. It says the federal government cannot deprive someone of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Later on, when they realized that we needed to also apply this to states, because states were going around depriving people of life, liberty, and property without due process of law, they passed the 14th Amendment that says this language, this concept, also applies to state actors, state government actors as well. That's the 14th Amendment. All right, so it's the 5th and the 14th Amendment. The 5th made it apply to the federal government, 14th Amendment made it apply to the state. So when you act in government and you're depriving someone or you're quarantining someone or isolating someone, this becomes important. Yes, sir.
Question,
Oh,
do you have to have, for so many of the other standards, have the burden of the common good?
Yes.
If you have that in the same section, do you have to prove that there's a common good as to whatever action you're taking?
From what I understand about this and the way that I said, there has to be a scientific evidence base for what you're doing.
Proof that what you're doing is right.
That's right, that's right. And I would be willing to guess, in other instances, it's true too. Like if I'm taking your,
The notice piece, yeah, you have to have, I think in notice, the requirements differ from jurisdiction to
From state
jurisdiction.
to state.
So your attorney here might have a better idea for Ohio law, but I would say what goes in the notice other than just, what statute or reg it's under, and then, yeah.
Well, I mean, it depends entirely on what you're trying to do. So,
Sure.
I mean, civil rules and procedure, as far as just basic notice, giving it to them, apply civil rule for. And then depending on what you want to do, you go to court, get injunction, send a summons out to the individual if you, for a hoarding situation, your house, so it really just.
But
That's a broad question.
notice can be
I guess I
anything.
don't know.
Notice in some instances of due process can be, you put something in the paper, depending on what the topic is or what the issue is we're dealing with, right?
Do you ever have to provide like a justification other than doing it under the law? In your notice requirement?
Yeah, you have to be specific as to what authority you're at. What section of the code you're in.
Yeah.
But the code's pretty broad. The nuisance code's pretty broad.
It's like, I mean, it's actually a crime in the state of Ohio to different options. We can simply go out and find them. It's not much.
$150, that's a lot. That's significant. Yeah. With all your dogs.
I don't, they ever like moved to bite anybody, if they ever like moved off of them. But anyway, so the hearing part though, sure, so once you get past the notice piece and you offer somebody a hearing, you might be provided for public health justification, right?
Yes, I'm gonna give you an example. Next slide. Okay, so there's two types of due process, for your purposes. Is this in your slides? No, y'all got different slides, I changed the slides, sorry. Okay, because I knew you were talking about preemption, and I wanted to touch on the two limitations. All right, so procedural due process and substantive due process. I have what we call a Montreesism, things that I make up. Procedural due process, the root there is procedural process, so it's sort of the processing part of due process. Did the government allow the right to a fair and impartial legal proceeding, some sort of court hearing, some sort of opportunity to be heard by the person from whom you're depriving life, liberty, or property? That's procedural due process. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to happen immediately, right? Someone's got an infectious disease and you need to quarantine them. It may take a few minutes or a few weeks even before that hearing actually takes place. How would that work in Ohio?
I think we've never had to do that, so.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're gonna walk through the scenario and pretend like we're in Ohio and we're walking through that scenario. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
It's immediate, the health commissioners do authority of work to immediately serve notice with the deputy that would be in isolation.
Exactly. And it may be a while before a hearing is actually held.
Yes, you have, for TB, it's 48 or 72 hours, you have to have administrative hearing before the judge.
What about Zika?
It's not listed as far as I know in that section of statute. TB
Ebola?
is very clear.
Ebola?
Couldn't answer that specifically, but I think most of the quarantine isolation laws are about the same. TB is the only one.
Okay. All right, next slide. Substantive due process asks the question, does the government have an appropriate justification for depriving someone of life, liberty, or property? So the question of, show me something. Do you have a justification for what you're doing? Where's the scientific evidence base for quarantining and isolating me? Is Zika worth quarantining and isolating? Probably not, given the way that it's spread, right? Is Ebola, when you first come off an airplane from an Ebola-affected country and you don't have any symptoms, should I quarantine and isolate you? We got public health folks in the room, and y'all want to answer with conviction? What's the answer? Right, next slide.
You're scared of you, Montre.
Okay. Okay, so you guys recognize this lady? Who's this? She's the one riding her bike. That's the story, right? Does anybody remember her name? Casey Hickox. So Casey Hickox came back from Sierra Leone, which was an Ebola-affected country. She was a nurse. She gets off the airplane in the state of New Jersey, and New Jersey immediately says, you need to be isolated. Not quarantined. Actually, I think they used the word quarantine, but they isolated her. She says, no. CDC says 21 days of monitoring my movement. What is active monitoring? I'm not supposed to be isolated. I'm not sick. No difference between quarantine and isolation. I wish the media would get it, but that's another conversation. I'm not sick. You shouldn't be isolating me, but they did, right? And then she's like, I want to go home to Maine. And I think she probably thought, I go home to Maine. They won't isolate me up in Maine. They did. They will isolate you in New Jersey. We're going to just be safe if they're going to isolate you too. She finally gets her procedural due process and has a hearing. Part of the judge's work, probably the clerk's work, is to figure out the substantive piece of it. Go back, not go over that. Does the government have an appropriate justification for depriving her of her life, liberty, or property, for depriving her of her freedom? Does the government have an appropriate justification? What do you think the court said? You think they said yes? What do you think the court said? Anybody? What do you guys think? No.
language that came directly from the court. Directly from the court. And the idea here is, yeah, we recognize you have the authority to quarantine and isolate somebody. But it's gotta be based on the science. And, you know, I don't know what the Ohio policy was, not Ohio, but what the main policy was at the time. But this case went back to CDC language, even putting it in all caps, direct active monitoring. That was our policy guidance language, direct active monitoring for 21 days. As the court said, basically, according to the information presented to the court, respondent currently does not show any symptoms of Ebola and is therefore not infectious. Should these circumstances change, then, you know, we would know that if you did what CDC told you to do, which was monitor, not directly monitor actively. But under the circumstances, there's no need to currently isolate her. At this point, I think then the 21 days have passed, so it's about time to bring it out anyway. But I like this because it shows an example, a clear example of the limitations on our authority in a modern scenario. Now, ultimately, nothing's gonna happen to the state of Maine for having quarantine for her. I mean, I guess she could potentially sue for violation of civil rights, right, potentially. The action that they took was just not upheld. And so that's the risk that is taken, in addition to the risk that she could potentially sue for something she wanted to sue for money because they took away her civil liberties, right? Okay, I think that's it for me. Any questions, thoughts, or comments? I did so good. I'm proud of myself.
You're early, 5 minutes, man. I'm gonna get a 10-minute break.
Okay, so I think it's a great time. You guys get a 10-minute break. We'll get started right at 10:35. And we'll talk about preemption, federalism, and police powers.
No, she basically said, sorry.